So, good morning, everyone. In the last class, we have discussed in brief about um, what do we mean by impact assessment and uh, what does the definition of impact assessment from the perspective of causal inference and what is not impact assessment. So in many of the papers, we see that the impact term is being kind of loosely used, but from the theory of causal inference, what is impact assessment? So all those things we have simply seen and also explored why correlation doesn't mean causation. So in impact assessment techniques or the theory of causal inference, we are concerned about establishing a causal relation, which means to say that you can say X is causing Y and delta Y is caused because of delta X, which means some changes in X, which is the cause, is resulting in some changes in Y, which is your outcome. Let us continue our discussion on the impact assessment principles. Let us try to elaborate a bit more on why the usual analytical tools like a dummy variable regression or a simple comparison cannot give you a causal relationship, cannot estimate a causal relationship. So what are the foundations or the basic principles on which all the impact assessment methods rest on? So one commonly used term in causal inference literature is data exchangeability. So what is this data exchangeability? So remember, go back to last class and try to remember how we define impact. You have two groups. Okay, one is a treated group and another one is a control group. So the treated group receives the treatment or they are the adopters of a technology, and the control group doesn't get the treatment. They are the non-adopters of the technology. So you have a treated group, you have a control group. And if your estimate of impact has to be credible and consistent, then there should be data exchange. So what is this data exchange? Now you have a treated group and control group. Let us interchange it. Okay. So which means to say that we will convert the control group into a treated group and the treated group will be converted into a control group. Adopters will become non-adopters, non-adopters will become adopters. So in one scenario, you have an adopter, non-adopter. In the next scenario, you are going to interchange it and non-adopters are becoming adopters and non-adopters, adopters become non-adopters. And then you compare the estimate of impact in both the instances. Suppose if the impact coefficient or the estimated impact is same in both the cases, then we say that it is data exchangeable, which means even when you interchange the treatment and the control, the impact doesn't change. This is a very important condition and it's more of a kind of intuition, you can say. When can this happen? Just think of a practical situation. Let us take the famous case of varietal adoption, a very common case. So what happens in a varietal adoption is, so your theory of extension says that adopters are the farmers who are, say, kind of well connected and they have a good communication, they are educated, and also they are kind of large farmers with sufficient resources. So in general, the theory of extension says that innovators are the farmers who are in general better farmers. And who are the non-adopters? They are the laggards, those who have less education, those who have some kind of inhibition towards the new technology. And all those farmers are in the country. What happens when you interchange? All the laggards will get the new variety and all the innovators will get the old variety. So laggards by design, they are kind of not so good farmers. By design, the innovators are good farmers. So even without a new variety, the innovators might get a better yield. So the treatment and control group, when they are interchanged, results in different impacts. So the assumption of data exchangeability doesn't hold. Okay. So when can this happen? Let us ask that question, which is important. When can data exchangeability holds? Data exchangeability holds if and only if your treatment group and control group are exactly similar to each other except for the treatment, which means so you have adopter and non-adopter, and only thing which differentiates the two groups is what is that? Adoption. If you have a group of say beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries of a training program, only thing that differentiates the two groups is that particular program. Except that you take out that, the two groups are exactly similar to. I think most of you have done a course on experimental methods in your undergraduate course. So the very first lesson in experimental methods is the principles of experimentation. In principles of experimentation, we talk about randomization, we talk about replication, then we talk about local control. So what does local control mean? I will take one agronomic research to explain this. Suppose agronomist wants to know the uh, effectiveness of different NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium doses on growth parameters and yield parameters. Right. So how we design this? Suppose he has T1, T2, T3 designation for treatment 1, first NPK combination, treatment 2, second NPK combination, T3, third NPK combination, and fourth one may be some kind of control. So how do he runs his experiment? What does local control mean in the context of this particular example? So in this particular example, local control means the difference between the four treatments, T1, T2, T3, and check. There are four treatment arms. The only difference between these four treatment arms should be the treatment itself, which means the difference between T1 and T2 is only with respect to N, P, and K, not with respect to irrigation, not with respect to weeding. So if you have done weeding on day 15 in T1, you should also do weeding in T3, T2, and T4. Otherwise, it will, whatever the difference in results or whatever difference in yield and growth parameters you get, you cannot attribute it to NPK alone because you have done weeding in different days. So the change in yield could be due to weeding also. So that is what local control. Translate that local control into observational study. In observational study, what we say, the treatment group and control group should be exactly similar to each other. If not, the difference in the income, difference in any of the outcome variable that you have considered cannot be attributed to the treatment alone. I think I made myself very clearly. To put the same thing in different words, when the treatment is not given and still you have a treatment and control, or go the other way around, if you take out the treatment and compare treatment and control group, there is nothing different between the two on an average. If you pick one person from the treatment group and one person from the control group and compare, they are bound to be different. You cannot have clones in here and here, right? So on an average, the treatment group and control group should be the same before the treatment is given. So as I told you earlier, when it comes to adoption of agriculture technology or beneficiaries of any government policy, this condition rarely holds because the two groups are different. Even let me give another example of say some kind of assistance which is given to BPL families, below poverty line families. By design, the program is designated for BPL households, right? So you cannot compare the other households with the BPL household because they are different with respect to so many other things, not just this particular. So far I have told you that why data exchangeability is a too strong assumption for observational study like social services. When does this data exchangeability course? When the treatment and group control groups and when they are going to be similar? Only when the treatment allocation is random. I will explain this. Before going into uh, what is this random allocation, there are three basic conditions to make a causal claim. One of the very well-written papers by Antonakis in 2010, he details three fundamental conditions to make a causal. In this example, let E be the effect and T be the cause. So E may be something like increase in outcome, increase in yield, improvement in welfare, any that kind of thing. And T be a cause, maybe a technology or a policy or beneficiary of being the beneficiary of a developmental program, developmental initiative, anything we can do T. Uh, Next thing, and the first condition for making a causal link is P must precede E. Okay, so the effect should happen on a later date. T must happen before. Then only T has caused E, right? So this is, I think, self-explanatory. Second is there is a strong and undeniable correlation, or more precisely, a causal relationship between T and I think you all have heard about spurious correlation and spurious relation. I also spoke about kind of spurious causations in case of, say, the classic example of spurious correlation is something like if you get married in church, you'll die early. So if you consider those two variables and try to see the relationship between them, they have a very high positive correlation. But that doesn't mean that there is actually causation. But at the same time, theoretically, there should be causation if you want to estimate a causal effect. You cannot simply pick two random events and say that this A is causing B and then fit a model and show that that is the case. But you should have an explanation, a theoretical explanation, a conceptual explanation, how A is going to cause a change in B, how A is going to influence B. So that is where there are the strong and undeniable theoretical causal relationship. I will explain this in detail. And the last one, the most difficult one to achieve, the relationship between the treatment and the effect, or the cause and the effect, should not be explained by any other causes. Just try to internalize this statement. This is same as saying the treatment and control group must be exactly similar in the absence of the treatment. This is also similar to saying that your treatment should be independent of all the covariates. Just think over it. Does treatment variable Don't confuse too much here. What does treatment variable mean? Treatment variable is a simple dummy variable indicating who are in the treated group and who are in the control group. Value of 1 if they are in treated, value of 0 when they are not treated. Does this mean or does this lead to T being random? This is a question you should brood over it, and we'll discuss it on that question. So from the point B, the strong, undeniable theoretical correlation or a theoretical causal relationship. Every paper on impact assessment uh, technology, so that is called as impact pathway. So this impact pathway indicates that from the treatment effect to the outcome, how does it translates. So you say that watershed development is a kind of treatment variable, and you say that increasing income is the outcome. So how does having a watershed results in higher income? So you have to indicate all those different pathways through which this happens. This is called impact pathway. So this is a world development paper by Datta in 2015. So this is very important. What happens when T or nothing but the cause is explained by other things? Okay, so we say that adopters are better educated, better connected than non-adopters. Let us consider T is equals to 1 for adopter, 0 for non-adopter. Intuitively, T is a function of education and extension contact. That is what we said. The adopters are, or the adoption process is a function of education and extension contact. If you write it in a functional form, it becomes T is a function of education and extension. There can be variables which are simultaneously affected by cause and also affects effect. They are called as confounders. Confounders are the variables which affects both the treatment allocation as well as the income. Take the case of education. You, in the first statement itself, you have made it clear that education leads to better adoption. That's one thing is done. Does education also affects yield or income? Yes. So it affects both the treatment allocation as well as the income. They are called as confounders. Confounders lead to a bias in your estimates of impact, that is called as confounding effect. Further classification is that confounders can be observed as in case of education. Confounders can also be unobserved, the case of motivation and other things. So I have already explained this, but let me explain one more time to make this very clear. Farmers who adopted technology are usually innovators. Innovative farmers are more likely to be educated and motivated. So, in general, you can say educated and motivated farmers are way more likely to adopt the technology. Non-adopters, on the other hand, are less educated and less motivated on an average. So directly we can say that education and motivation, they affect the treatment selection. Education and motivation, they affect the adoption process. But the problematic thing is that they also affect the outcome, that is income. Educated and motivated farmers are more income even without the technology. Even though both were growing the same variety, the treatment group might have got higher income. That is what I'm saying. If you take out the technology, there are other differences like education and motivation, because of which they might get higher yield. So if you simply compare the income across the two groups, it could be due to the variety that you're talking about. It could be due to education. It could be due to motivation. It could be due to many other things. So whatever the coefficient that you are getting, or the simple difference in mean, or the difference in outcome, cannot be a causal estimate. You cannot say that the change in income is exclusively due to the changes in the or due to adoption of the technology. So we cannot establish the causation. So this situation econometrically can be explained with the help of endogeneity. Endogeneity in terms of the precise definition is when an explanatory variable is correlated with the error term. So it violates the assumption of the OLS that the X is truly exogenous and the correlation between the X and the error term is zero. When it is not modeled, when the correlation between a particular variable X and the error term is not zero, estimate will be biased. Remember, biased estimates, and it also doesn't have a no flip in sign property, which means the direction of bias is also impossible to estimate. So if you do not account for endogeneity, it is garbage in, garbage out. The estimate will be absolutely useless. That is why we cannot use a dummy variable regression model to estimate the impact. So there are different forms of endogeneity which you study in econometrics 101. So something like omitted variable bias, there is measurement error, omitting a fixed defect simultaneously, and self-selection. So self-selection is nothing but your treatment effect being endogenous. What does mean treatment effect endogenous? Next slide I'll explain. This is also same as omitted variable bias. Let us assume your actual model looks like this. Yi is alpha plus beta 1 x1i plus beta 2 x2i plus ui. What you do, for some reason you don't measure x2i and you ignore the x2i and run the model. So what is the model you are now estimating? Yi is alpha plus theta 1 x1i plus vi. Delta 1 x1i plus vi. Since x2i is not included in the model, where does that effect goes? It is captured in the vi. So what will happen? If correlation between x1i and x2i is not equal to 0, which is most cases it is not the case, then the variable x1i is actually correlated with the error term vi, because x2i is correlated with x1i and x2i has its component in vi. So x1i intuitively is correlated with the error term vi. This is the violation of OLS assumption of endogeneity, and the other one is bias and cannot be used. So similarly, in case of impact assessment, let us say Y is the income of the farmer and T is a dummy variable for adoption, which means to say that 1 is for adopted and 0 is for non-adopted. Then you are going to run a model yi is equal to alpha plus beta 1 ti plus all other controls. Okay. So your beta 1 is supposed to be impact coefficient, which means what will happen to income due to adoption. But the problem here is T is endogenous. You have T, or the adoption is in turn dependent upon education, in turn depends upon motivation, in turn depends on extension content. So there is a separate equation for estimation of this. Selection equation Ti is equals to theta x1 ij plus ai, where xj include education, extension, contract, etc. So the ei and ui are correlated, causing endogenization or the bias. So you cannot use dummy variable regression. This is because of observed confounders, but to make the complicated things even more complicated, there are unobserved confounders. So you cannot use simple regression model with dummy variable to estimate the impact. Okay, so let me stop at this moment and we will discuss more on this in the next one. Thank you for